You know the Japanese Zero. Its stories have been told time and time again. The nimble and quick fighter that terrorized many Allied pilots for the early years of World War II. But in this video, we will cover some things that you may not know, the forgotten but still important truths about this famous warbird. So here are 5 fascinating and relatively unknown facts about the Japanese Zero. Now, many of you have asked me before, how do I make the incredible visuals you see in these videos? And I am thrilled to finally answer that, because it's actually the sponsor of this video, War Thunder. In case you haven't tried it yet, War Thunder is an incredible online military combat game that puts you in some of the most realistic warfare that you've ever seen. And best of all, it's absolutely free to play and is available on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. It's also fully cross-platform and doesn't require any complicated controls or hardware to play. A simple mouse and keyboard works just fine. So as soon as you get done watching this video, join 50 million other players across the world and go try War Thunder today at the link below. Play it for free and even add me as a friend. I play with viewers all the time and actually had a few TJ3 fans fly as extras in this very video. So join me and try the most immersive air, land, and sea combat game around, totally free. And by downloading at the link below, in the game you'll get a TJ3 History decal, a 7-day account boost, and a free premium tank, aircraft, and ship. So sign up today. Thanks again to War Thunder, and without further ado, enjoy. First on our list for today, we will talk about the fascinating first aerial victory for the famous Zero. As 1940 came about, the Empire of Japan was well into their conquest of China. Things were going well overall, but they were beginning to face stiff resistance in the air, both from the Chinese and from the American volunteer pilots that were presently defending their country. So, in the late summer of that year, the Navy sent a request for additional fighter aircraft to aid in their efforts for air supremacy. This was an obvious opportunity to test their newest fighter that had just been made ready for battle, the Zero. This newly developed aircraft was the product of a daunting challenge that the Japanese Navy had sent out. A contract for a new fixed-wing fighter that had outstanding climb rates as well as an unmatched level of maneuverability. Their standards were so high for this project that only one company would apply, Mitsubishi. And fortunately for Japan, they would rise to the occasion and blow expectations away. And now, in 1940, the project was ready to finally be tested in combat. And so, shortly after taking part in their first combat mission in August, the A6M2 would go on to score its first aerial victory on September 13th. On this occasion, 13 of the new Zeros would meet a force of roughly 30 Chinese fighters. These would actually be Soviet-made I-15s and I-16s. The Zero would jump straight away into a fray with the Chinese pilots, and the results of this first dogfight would be unbelievable. For a half hour, an intense air battle raged near the Chinese city of Chongqing. In this time, the Zeros proved to be far superior to the Soviet aircraft. The Chinese Nationalist Air Force pilots no doubt tried to turn with the Japanese aircraft, finding that this was a hopeless endeavor and that the Japanese fighters were not only extremely nimble in the air, but were also faster and more heavily armed than their normal counterparts. At the end of this engagement, the Japanese Lieutenant Saburo Sendou claimed that his Zeros had destroyed all of the Chinese planes without a loss of any of their own aircraft. The later historical records would show that 4 of the Zeros did receive damage, but that all would return to base, while the number of Chinese losses was well into the 20s for this first aerial battle. An astounding kill ratio to begin its combat career. This would prove to be an astounding victory for the Zero, and would be an undeniable testament to the potential of this impressive fighter. Next up, we will discuss an interesting aspect of this famous fighter that has often been neglected in the course of history. The fact that the Zero was actually a game changer for aerial warfare in that it leveled the playing field between seaborne and land-based aircraft. Up until this point in military combat, aircraft carriers had an extremely specific set of parameters that their aircraft had to stay within. This included storage size, weight, as well as takeoff and landing specifications. Because of these requirements, seaborne aircraft for the entirety of history were not exactly on the same playing field as land-based fighters. Any aircraft that took off from a carrier was far lighter, slower, and weaker than any plane that was based on land. One can easily take a look at the top carrier-based aircraft for other nations like the Brewster Buffalo or the Fairey Swordfish and see that this fact certainly rings true. In 1940, not even the most powerful nations around the world had any carrier-based aircraft that could hope to compete with their ground-based fighters like the P-40 Warhawk or the Hawker Hurricane. The next best option would soon be the F-4F Wildcat of the US Navy, but even this plane was 4 months away from introduction, and when it finally entered service, it was already outclassed by the Zero in speed, range, and maneuverability. Thus, when the Zero entered the war for the Japanese Navy, the playing field was truly changed forever. This was the first time in history that a plane could take off from the sea and confidently dogfight with any aircraft that it might run into, from a ship or from an airfield. This gave Japan a massive advantage in the open ocean and island campaigns that would benefit them greatly in the battles to come. Up next, at number 3, we will actually discuss a major shortcoming of the Zero, the incredibly inefficient method of production. In the early 1940s, when the Navy began to demand more fighters, pressure was put on the Japanese homeland to increase production to a large scale. Unfortunately, this would prove to be an extremely difficult task. Many are aware that one of the primary factors that contributed to the United States winning the war was its ability to ramp up production to a massive scale. The US had a vast pool of engineers, universities, and larger companies that were quickly able to pivot and adjust their economic contributions to creating war machines. Japan, on the other hand, lacked nearly all of these valuable resources. Their great engineers were limited, they lacked the large economy that the United States possessed, and because their military was plagued with quarrels between the Navy and Army, development of large-scale endeavors was often slow. Because of this, as late as 1943, instead of large-scale assembly line production, the Zero was still being handmade by teams of skilled tradesmen that often took great labor and great time. Halfway through the war, while the United States was pumping out aircraft in factories across the nation, each new Zero that was being made at one of the factories in Nagoya was actually still being hauled away from the production building by a team of oxen. As there was no airfield on site, each plane was too delicate to be placed on trucks, and there was no convenient railway nearby. Thus, they would have to be carried by the animals for 24 miles after production, leaving more than 20 oxen dead and the remaining 30 facing exhaustion by the end of 1943. Thus, in the heat of an all-out war, the crucial deliveries of Japan's most needed aircraft actually rested on the fate of a dwindling herd of underfed animals. At number 2, we will look at quite possibly the most impressive overall feature of the Zero that is quite often forgotten, its mind-boggling range. To go ahead and give some perspective, let's take a look at some of the comparable fighters of this time and their individual ranges. The Hawker Hurricane, 600 miles, the Bf-109, 700 miles, and the F-4F Wildcat, 845 miles. The earliest model of the Zero, however, boasted a range of an astounding 1,180 miles, thanks to its trading of armor for speed and fuel efficiency. This was a huge asset for the naval-based fighter because it meant that in an engagement, the Zero could often strike the enemy 200 to 300 miles before any opposing aircraft could ever hope to get into range of its own carrier fleet. Thus, the Zero always had the opportunity to strike first and was able to keep its valuable carriers out of harm's way. In fact, this range was so unheard of, specifically early on in the war, that it actually deceived United States military commanders. The range of the Zero was so large that Japanese pilots would strike targets all over the Pacific, up to 500 miles away from their carrier, and then come all the way back home. And while they did this, United States brass made assumptions about the aircraft having a comparable range to their own, so the attacks did not make any sense based on these assumed specifications. So, the United States actually began to think that Japan had a nearly endless supply of Zeros because they were showing up all over the Pacific. But in reality, Japan did not have high numbers at all. Their carrier force was simply able to launch them and hit a huge variety of targets all across the battlefield with their incredible range, giving the illusion of much larger numbers than actually existed. And finally, at number 1, we will take a look at a few of the close calls that Japan had early on in the war that could have changed the course of the conflict. For the first few years of the war, the United States was desperate to get their hands on a Japanese Zero. They were struggling to compete with the new fighter and wanted to learn what allowed this aircraft to perform so well. But their efforts would be in vain. The fighter was so light that it often broke apart or disintegrated in crashes, so most wreckage was unusable. But there were 2 times in 1941 that the United States military very nearly got their hands on a prized Japanese fighter, but fate would barely keep them from having it. Both of these would take place in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. In this famous opening salvo of the Pacific War, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would participate in the bombing of the American fleet. But what history is often overlooked is that in this attack, 2 Zeros were shot down and very nearly fell into the hands of the United States, fully intact. The first was an aircraft piloted by Takeshi Hirano. It would be shot down, but would crash from a low altitude into Building 52 at Fort Kamehameha. It was the most well-preserved Zero that the US had ever seen, but unfortunately it was extremely damaged, specifically in the fuselage. This prevented the United States from taking too much information from it, as it was not able to be put back into flying condition. Also on this day, however, another Zero would be shot down. This one was piloted by Shigenori Nishikaichi and would be forced to crash land on its way back home to the Japanese carrier force. During this, he would bring his plane down intact on the Hawaiian island of Niihau, expecting to be rescued by a submarine very soon. He was instead taken prisoner by locals shortly after landing, and thus his fully preserved Zero sat in the grass waiting on American soil. But unfortunately for the United States, the Japanese pilot would actually end up escaping from captivity and was killed in a fight with the civilians. But before this, he was able to make it back to his downed fighter, setting fire to the Zero and preventing it from falling into American hands, thus keeping its valuable secrets hidden for the foreseeable future. Quick reminder for you guys, don't forget to try War Thunder today. Use the link below to go to battle in over 2,000 beautiful military vehicles, dogfight over tons of maps in realistic and immersive air combat, and even add me as a friend and I'll see you in the skies. Please comment on what plane I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.